Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Stacy Stemich, Board Chair of Building a Better Bend. We are really excited to have you all here this evening. Building a Better Bend is a nonprofit organization that was founded nearly 20 years ago with the mission of bringing expert speakers to share their experience in ways to positively affect the quality of development here in Bend. Many of my fellow board members in the audience this evening, and I'd like to invite them to stand up so you can see the talented people that we have on our board. I would also like to take a moment to ask any elected or appointed officials in the attendance to stand up, and this is one of the reasons why we have these lectures. Our annual lecture series wouldn't be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. Our series title sponsor this year is First Interstate Bank, and I'd like to welcome Todd Ulrich, VP of Commercial Relations Manager of First Interstate Bank, to share some words.
Thank you for coming tonight. Again, my name is Todd Ulrich, Commercial Relationship Manager for First Interstate Bank. As we talk about the program tonight and what Build a Better Bend does for the community, I wanted to just kind of toot our own horn a little bit about what First Interstate Bank does for the communities here in Central Oregon. Through 2% of our pre-tax net income, we're able to give back to our communities. And if John would be kind enough to stand up and show us our board here. This is our scorecard in 2024, which we were able to give over $400,000 back to our communities in donations, sponsorship. There we go. And then also in our volunteerism throughout the community with different nonprofits. So I just think it's a great partnership with what we do in the community along with organizations like this. So thank you for coming. Have a good night.
All right, thank you. I would also like to thank Brooks Resources, Cascadia Partners, Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council, the Energy Trust of Oregon, and Kittles and Associates for making this lecture series happen. Thank you each to these organizations. Additionally, we have a delightfully long list of partners for this year's series, including Project, Walker Macy, Eco Northwest, Dowell, Kelcon, Sunwest Builders, Ashley Vance Engineering, Hand in Hand Productions, Stemich Design and Architecture, 10 Over Studio, and LRS Architects. Thank you all so much for your support. Now to introduce tonight's speaker and topic. In the face of increasing likelihood of wildfire, extreme heat, drought, and damaging storms, cities and community organizations around the country are increasingly deploying resilience hubs as a means to help safeguard community members in times of emergency. How do we bring resilience hubs to Bend? This evening, we'll hear from Steve Abbott, a principal at RMI, formerly Rocky Mountain Institute. Steve leads RMI's programmatic efforts to help U.S. cities and communities leverage federal programs and incentives to accelerate the adoption of clean technologies. This work builds on Stephen's 10 years of experience supporting a variety of organizations, from universities and large companies, and his team specializes in providing a combination of technical insights, best practices, and tactical guidance to support communities in implementing equitable, clean solutions. Please join me in welcoming Steve.
Good evening. That is loud, sorry. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. I was really thrilled to be invited here to Bend. I'm embarrassed to say this is my first time in the city, but I got a wonderful tour. Thank you, Karen and Stacy, for that. And I love all the roundabouts, the views from your local volcanoes. It's a really wonderful place, and I'm am looking forward to coming back again in the future. So I'm going to be talking about opportunities for local, clean, resilient electricity. This is based on the work that my team has been doing around the country. We've seen a growing level of interest in resilience hubs from the cities we're working with, and I'm here to share some of those experiences with you here today. Before I get too far into resilience hubs, I want to give you a little bit of background on RMI and some of the ways in which we approach problems. So I'm going to start with an introduction to RMI's approach, which I will then reference throughout the talk at various points. Then Stacy already teed this up, but I'll provide a little bit more background on some of why we're seeing a growing interest in resilience hubs across the country and resilience solutions generally. Then I'll turn to microgrids, which is a particular type of solution and how they can provide clean, local, resilient energy. Then I'll expand that into resilience hubs, which are leverage microgrids as part of a solution to meet a variety of community needs. I'll then close out with a conversation or a bit of a discussion about how Bend can support resilience hubs and some different actionable steps you could take in the coming months. And then I'll end with a quick conclusion. So first, what is RMI? We're an independent global nonprofit organization. We were founded in the Rocky Mountains, but we are now international. There's about 600 of my colleagues around the world. And we work to accelerate clean energy solutions. This is a picture of my colleague, Ian Welch Phillips. This is down in St. Lucia, where he was installing microgrids at 8 local critical facilities on the island. I'm currently working with him on a project out in Rhode Island. RMI's mission is to transform the global clean energy system to accelerate a clean, prosperous, secure, zero carbon future for all. And a lot of RMI's work stems from the insights and ways of thinking of one of our co-founders, Amory Lovins. And I'm going to talk about some of his work on energy efficiency and the insights he brought to the energy world. This first one is dubbed Tunneling Through the Cost Barrier. And it represents, this chart that I'm showing you now represents a common way of thinking about energy efficiency that was common at the time. Let's imagine you were renovating your home. And you wanted it to be more energy efficient. You could install LED light bulbs. You could put more insulation into your attic. You could install higher efficiency windows. And most people would take the approach of looking at each of those things in isolation and say, is this going to save enough energy to make the cost worthwhile? Is it going to meet my cost thresholds? And the challenge with that, or the thing that Amory brought to the conversation, was to say, actually, if you only look at these things in isolation, you're potentially missing a big piece of the picture, in that if you actually keep going, if you do more of these energy efficiency things, collect and add them all up together, in aggregate, they can unlock more savings, both in terms of energy and in cost savings. And this sounds great, but to actually illustrate what this looks like, I want to turn to the retrofit that RMI did on the Empire State Building. We were approached back in 2009, 2010 by the owners of the Empire State Building to do what's called a deep retrofit, where we went in and looked at all of the energy systems that were feeding into and helping that building run. And in large part by going and retrofitting all of the windows in the building, which was a pretty major undertaking, we were able to reduce energy usage in the building by over 50%. We actually set up a factory inside the Empire State Building to help do this. But the point is that because the building was so much more efficient as a result of all of that investment, we were able to reduce the size of the cooling system and the heating system by 1/3. The capital costs on that alone saved $17 million, which then largely paid for the efficiency investments. Another way you can look at energy efficiency is that it actually provides compounding savings. To explain that, I want to just ground us in the fact that a lot of our energy system right now is pretty wildly inefficient when you stop and think about it. Let's imagine a situation where you have a coal-fired generator that's generating electricity to then ultimately move water through a pipe. You start with, let's say, 100 units of energy embedded in the coal. You burn it, that boils water and spins a turbine, and 70% of the energy that was in that coal goes up in smoke, quite literally, in the process. You then lose energy in the wires, in the motor, in the drivetrain, in the pump, in the friction in the pipes, and at the end, only 9.5 units of energy actually gets to moving the water through the pipes out of that original 100. This is kind of a depressing thing to realize, but the twist on that is that any reduction in the amount of energy you need at the far end of this system has compounding savings, because you're avoiding all of that waste and inefficiency by not needing that energy at the end. Amory always loves to say people want cold beers and hot showers. We don't really care how we get those services. We care about the outputs. And so the goal is to try to design an energy system that will deliver those services with the least waste possible. An example of this was a company called Interface Inc. They wanted to reduce energy in the carpet factory they had in the Netherlands. And an obvious place to start might have been to just go and buy more efficient pumps and motors for their factory. But in fact, by using fat, short, straight pipes to move water through the facility, they were able to cut the friction in the pipes by 86%, which then, again, let them buy smaller motors and pumps. And this overall point about always starting with energy efficiency and thinking about what you actually want, as opposed to the systems, immediately jumping to the systems to get it, is just going to be an ongoing theme that I invite us to come back to. So now I'm going to turn to a depressing part of the presentation. We will get to a more optimistic point in a little bit here. And I want to ground us in the reality that you all, as members of a community, have the ability to act. So everything I'm about to talk about is not necessarily things that we have to just react to passively. But the reality is, as Stacy mentioned, that communities are experiencing the impacts of climate change today. Many of you in this room will remember the heat wave that hit the Northwest in 2021. And these heat waves are, of course, becoming more common. Alongside this, wildfires and droughts are becoming more common. In 2022, wildfires consumed 7.5 million acres across the United States. And of course, we're all familiar with the fires earlier this year in LA that caused an estimated $250 billion in damages. Hurricanes are also growing more powerful and destructive. Recent examples of this include Hurricane Helene in 2024, which caused $80 billion in damages across the Southeast and caused about 80 landslides. And a couple of years before that, Hurricane Ian caused $120 billion of damages, mostly in Florida, and dumped 10 to 20 inches of rain on parts of the state. Right now, Hurricane Melissa is hitting Jamaica and may dump 30 inches of rain on the island. And somewhat counterintuitively, but I think we've all had this lived experience as well, winter storms are becoming more intense. This is related to the weakening jet stream and the pockets of Arctic air that thus come down into the US periodically. An example of this is in 2021, Winter Storm Uri, which killed 200 people and left 4.5 million without power. Interestingly, 50% of Texas's generation comes from natural gas generators. And one of the challenges that they were hitting was that a lot of the equipment in these generators was freezing. Also, the pipes were freezing, which limited flow. And then this had a sort of a circular negative impact of then, as the electric grid failed, a lot of the wellheads had to stop producing, which contributed further to the problem. And so all of this together means that the frequency and severity of extreme weather is rising quickly. This here is a chart that until recently was managed by NOAA, a federal agency, and it tracks billion-dollar disasters in the United States over the last 30 years or so. And you can see pretty clearly in around 2000 the sharp uptick that we've been seeing. One note, wildfires here are represented in orange. You'll note that they appear pretty small. I think that's largely because wildfires mostly are occurring in forested areas and are not causing massive property damage in all cases. And as such, they're a little bit underrepresented here. If you go and look at the number of acres consumed per year, you see kind of a similar trend with some annual variation. Another interesting new wrinkle to grid reliability is one that's more human-caused and is actually related to the data center deployments that are cropping up across the country. We are seeing clusters of very large-scale data centers that are being added, both in areas that already had them, but are also proliferating across the country as the large tech companies and data center providers seek power arrangements. Before I get there, these are truly massive in some cases. There are multiple sites that are a gigawatt in scale or more. That is the size of a very large coal generation power plant. Some of these are also physically large, they're like the size of Manhattan. And I just say that to impress upon you that these are very large and consume a very large amount of electricity, which is part of why these next two things are potentially problematic. The first is that these facilities have a tendency to drop offline if there is any surge in the power grid. And the result of this means that if you have large clusters of these data centers and they all go offline all at the same time, the grid manager then has to balance the fact that they have way more supply on the system than they have demand. And that is the central key thing that a grid manager always must do. They must ensure that supply and demand are always in balance. So when you have gigawatts of load dropping off in milliseconds, it makes their job very difficult. And we've had 2 near misses in Virginia and Texas of this already happening. Another issue is that these data centers are very large and their loads can fluctuate quite significantly on a millisecond time frame, particularly with AI training data sets. And this, anecdotally, we've also seen evidence that this kind of behavior is eroding power quality. So places where you have a lot of data centers concentrated, the frequency of the power is less stable, and this can cause problems for anyone who has a surge protector under their desk to protect their computer. That's basically what it's there for, to protect you from surges in the power grid. All of this has led the president of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, also known as NERC, to say that this is a 5-alarm fire for grid reliability in the country. And of course, for many of us, blackouts are an inconvenience, but they can also be life-threatening in a lot of circumstances. They can leave people vulnerable to extreme temperatures, interrupt communications. For those who rely on home medical equipment or medicine, it can impair the operation of that equipment or the storage of that medicine. They can limit mobility for those who typically use elevators or wheelchairs. And they inhibit emergency responder effectiveness. Meanwhile, federal resources for local resilience efforts are diminishing. The bill that Congress passed over the summer removed incentives for rooftop solar and home energy efficiency upgrades, and key programs run by NOAA, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that study weather and climate risks are being cut. And just this past April, FEMA canceled up to $1.5 billion in funding for local resilience efforts. Okay, we're through the depressing part. Thank you for bearing with me. But you are not helpless in this, and you have a range of options to mitigate and adapt to these new environments. This, again, is a picture of one of my colleagues down in Puerto Rico celebrating the installation of a solar microgrid. So microgrids, I've been talking about them. I'm going to actually delay defining them again for a minute to talk a little bit about what resilience is in the context of the power sector. So what makes a system resilient? One is, these are observations that I pulled from the Resilient Design Institute, and it's just a selection of some of their design principles that seemed relevant for today. One is that diverse and redundant systems are inherently more resilient. Another is that simple, passive, and flexible systems are more resilient. And the third, locally available, renewable, or reclaimed resources are more resilient. And I'm going to talk about all three of these in more detail in the context of the power sector. So, ignore that chart for right now. Diverse, redundant systems. So I want to start by just noting that no form of electricity generation is 100% reliable. We sort of have this intuition that things like coal plants and nuclear plants run all the time, and they often do run quite frequently, but all of them, and as we've seen in the case of Winter Storm Uri, all of these are subject to potentially either scheduled outages or unplanned outages of one form or another. As a result, grids use a portfolio of generators that are diversified across technologies and geographies to try to provide reliable electricity service. And there are different ways of assessing this reliability. One is often referred to as a capacity factor. That's a measure of how often over the year a generator is operating compared to operating all the time. And then the other, which is what I am showing in the chart here, is a fairly wonky term called the effective load carrying capacity. But basically what grid operators do is they run simulations to say, when are the hours of the year where we're going to most need generation? And then how likely do we think it is that different types of generators are going to be able to provide power in those peak periods? This on the right here now is a chart showing the ELCC, or the effective load carrying capacity, that a grid operator in the New Jersey to Chicago general region has estimated. And you'll see that nuclear is quite high. It's very costly to turn nuclear plants off and turn them on again, so you do generally want to keep them running all the time. But then you'll note that things like natural gas combined cycle generators are down at roughly 3/4 of the time, and onshore wind is about 40%. Two items that I wanted to particularly call out here are one, demand resources. Demand resources is sort of the other side of the coin. We generally think of people trying to add supply when we need more electricity. Demand resources is saying the other way to keep supply and demand in balance is to reduce demand. And there's a variety of ways you can do that by, say, asking manufacturers to pause operations, having supermarkets dim their lights, or pre-cooling things like freezers in restaurants. So it doesn't necessarily have to imply that you are not running your air conditioning at home on a hot day. There's a variety of flexibility tools available. The other one I wanted to note is 10-hour batteries. And we'll talk a lot more about batteries in the context of microgrids in a bit. But they are an increasingly important part of the, I think, emerging grid that we are moving towards in the future. Second, simple, passive, flexible systems. So first, I want to note that machines with fewer parts, just kind of intuitively and all else being equal, are less likely to break down and are cheaper to maintain than machines with lots of moving parts. And this can be seen, for example, in electric vehicles, which are fundamentally a lot more simple if you disregard the battery chemistry. There's a lot fewer moving parts in an EV as compared to a traditional internal combustion engine vehicle. In terms of passive systems, I heard today that you all have some passive houses here in Bend, so you're familiar with this concept. But if you have ways of doing things that don't have moving parts at all, or that don't require physical work to achieve your objective, those are also inherently going to be more resilient because you're not relying on outside energy sources or outside forces helping you do the work to maintain your desired state. And an example of this in the picture here, RMI has an office up in the mountains near Aspen, Colorado. And we've used a variety of passive approaches to achieve a 74% reduction in energy usage in that building compared to a typical office building in that environment. And then finally, flexible systems. I think this is kind of intuitive, but just like a tree can bend in the wind, any system that can have some degree of flexibility is less likely to break under pressure. And things like demand response that I was just talking about and batteries are forms of flexibility that you can add into the electrical system. I mentioned virtual power plants here. That's when you take groups of batteries and demand response resources and combine them all together. So it's sort of like you have a power plant that is distributed across a community. And finally, local renewable systems are more resilient. So local renewable systems are less dependent on potentially long supply chains that can face a variety of disruptions, from extreme weather to conflict to national policy. In the electricity industry, relatedly, the vast majority of outages are in fact caused by failures in the transmission and distribution system as opposed to generation failures. On the right here, I have a chart from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that shows this. The blue and the orange bars represent failures in the transmissions and distribution systems. Blue is for kind of normal operating days, orange is for extreme weather. The tiny sliver of gray in the top represents those times when there was an outage as a result of a failure of generation. So as a result, I think it's also fair to say that local renewable systems, in the context of energy, you often say have a diesel generator as a backup power source, but these are reliant on the ability to get diesel to where you need it. And if your roads are blocked, if there's wildfires, if you're not creating diesel locally, you may not be able to resupply those tanks. I wanted to also note that these local renewable resources can also offer a form of financial resilience. Over here on the left, I have a graph of the residential electricity prices experienced in US cities over the last 10 years. And those prices have gone up about 40% since 2020. I want to also note, and this is a much longer topic, but at a high level, energy markets, I think, face an increasing risk of disruption based from fuel price volatility. Say, for example, if the war in Ukraine has had major shocks to natural gas prices, technological change, the dramatic reductions we've seen in wind and solar costs over the last 15 years are an example of that, and I think more is coming. Climate change effects, and various domestic and international policy shifts. As a result, communities may want to think about local renewable projects as a way to hedge against possible future shocks in the electricity system and prices, because if you buy solar panels and install them, or if you buy a wind turbine, you pretty much know what that electricity is going to cost you for the next 20 to 30 years. So finally, microgrids. Microgrids are local combinations of assets that combine local generation with demand controls and storage to maintain power through outages. There are 3 or 4 primary components. One is the generation, which can be a variety of things like wind, solar, geothermal, combined heat and power, or traditional generation. You typically want a battery, again, to help balance that supply and demand. That's just as important at the local level as it is at the grid level. You need controls to help do that. And then you need an on-off switch. Basically, you need to be able to decouple your little microgrid from the bigger grid. For anyone who has rooftop solar, I just wanted to note that if you have an outage, your rooftop solar right now has to turn off unless you have special switchgear or a battery. That's to protect linemen who might be working on the lines. They don't want to risk them getting shocked. But the result is that unless you have that on-off switch, you're not able to actually continue to generate during outages. And I'll note that different types of generation in a microgrid are going to have varying benefits. I think it's fair to say that a fossil fuel generation approach like a diesel genset or a micro turbine, they tend to have lower upfront costs, and they can be weather independent. So as long as you have access to the fuel, as we talked about, you're able to run those continuously as long as they're in good working order. On the renewable side, if you have solar panels with a battery, one benefit of those is they're going to provide you ongoing cost savings, even in normal operations. You don't typically run a diesel generator if everything is working fine. It's only used in an outage, whereas a solar and a battery system can be run every day and provide benefits to you and the grid every day. Secondly, they don't provide any pollution, which can be a big issue. If you have everybody running diesel gensets or micro turbines during an outage, that actually does create significant air pollution problems in communities. And finally, they're fuel supply independent. So if those supply chains are disrupted, you're able to continue to operate. And I'll note that these are not kind of theoretical things. The US military has deployed fully clean microgrids here in the United States. This is a picture of Fort Hunter Liggett in California. They have 3.5 megawatts of solar with a 5 megawatt hour battery. And that system can provide the base with 14 days of uninterrupted coverage. So now I'll turn to resilience hubs. And I want to talk about how they expand on the idea of microgrids to also meet a variety of other community needs. So this graphic might be hard to see. It was created by the city of Austin. But the point is to illustrate that a resilience hub may have solar, it's going to have battery storage, but it's also going to have a variety of other things that will invite the community in on a day-to-day basis. It may have educational programming, it may have shade, EV charging, or a variety of other things that are going to meet the community where they are at and bring benefits to the community on a day-to-day basis. Fundamentally, resilience hubs are meant to be community centers that act as community centers every day of the year, and then also act as emergency shelters when there is an event. And there is a variety of benefits that these types of facilities might create within communities. These range from public health and safety. They can, which I think are fairly obvious benefits. They can provide community energy cost savings by reducing the bills of the community center. They can improve local air quality by mitigating the need to run diesel generators. If you offer types of trainings or workforce development at the local community center, they can provide economic stability and job training opportunities. If you locate these hubs in vulnerable communities, they can support social equity. They can, importantly, help foster a more community cohesion throughout the year by offering a gathering place to community members. They can provide municipal cost savings, and they can also provide resources and materials to the community. So I'm going to go through a few case studies of where we've seen other cities deploy networks of these resilience hubs. One is the city of Baltimore. They started thinking about the need for greater resilience back in as early as 2014. And they started by having a lot of conversations with different community groups about what they really needed in that community. And they started building partnerships with local CBOs, local trusted organizations to stand up these local resilience hubs across the city. And these centers have served a variety of purposes since they have been installed. They have acted as cooling centers during heat waves when outages hit the city and people needed to stay cool. They've distributed sandbags during flooding events. They've provided phone charging stations to people during outages. And during COVID, they acted as testing and vaccination centers as well. As of a few years ago, the city had stood up 17 of these hubs across the city, 4 of which had received solar plus storage systems. My team and I had the opportunity to go visit a variety of facilities in New Orleans. There's a group there called Together New Orleans, which has been doing really amazing work standing up what they are calling community lighthouses. These are resilience hubs that are based in houses of worship. There are about 17 across the city. And importantly, they haven't just built the facilities, they have stood up a whole process and system to invite people to come to those facilities when there is an outage. So they've collected phone numbers of people in the area, and they have a system to text everybody in the neighborhood when there's an outage saying, come to the church, the lights are on, there's water, you can charge your phone. And then the last one I wanted to note was an example of expanding microgrids across a community. And this is some really exciting work that is just starting in Ann Arbor, Michigan. This picture is from when we worked with the city on a heat pump project. But in 2024, just last year, voters in Ann Arbor formally established what they are calling a Sustainable Energy Utility, or SEU. The SEU will consist ultimately of a variety of community-owned solar plus storage facilities. And interestingly, because of their relationship with the local utility, this is not going to replace DTE's infrastructure. It's going to be built in parallel to it. So they're starting with individual buildings, but the hope is to ultimately start to connect these systems such that neighbors can share power across within their neighborhood and community in the event of an outage in particular. All right. How are we all doing? Good. Okay. I'm going to wrap up with a few actionable steps for what Bend can do to support resilience hubs through a variety of policy actions, engagement with different stakeholders, and direct deployment. So this slide just says those three things again. We're going to start with the enacting supportive policies and programs. One thing I want to tee up front here is that right now, when you go and install rooftop solar at a commercial facility or at a house, more than 50% of the cost is not actually the equipment. It's actually the labor, the advertising, the customer acquisition, the permitting, the interconnection, the paperwork, the administration, all of these things that are referred to as soft costs in the industry. And the good news is that cities actually have a lot of opportunity to help reduce soft costs for these types of projects in their footprint. So examples of ways that they can do this are, by one, streamlining permitting. I don't know what the situation is in Bend, but in some jurisdictions I've heard that permitting can take weeks, if not months. And it's a real problem for solar development and homeowners. Sometimes the homeowners will cancel the project because they get sick of waiting. There are new methods that are already out in the market and tested to either expedite this permitting process or actually fully automate it in the majority of cases. Solar App is a program that was developed by DOE and the National Renewable Energy Lab, and it is one of those platforms. Another opportunity is to remove zoning barriers that might be prohibiting homeowners or businesses from putting solar on their property. Third is just educating community members, telling them more about solar, helping them understand what it might look like for them to install solar or batteries on their property. And then if you wanted to be more active about it, cities around the country have previously run what are called solarized programs. This is sort of when a city or a nonprofit will organize a time-limited deal for local community members. They go out, they do an RFP, they find a set of trusted installers that have been pre-vetted. They say, we're going to help you acquire customers. And then they give people in the community, say, 3 months to 6 months to sign up for the program and benefit from the discounts. And this achieves both the goals of educating community members and also helping to further reduce costs. If you want more information about ways that cities can be supportive in these ways, I'd recommend SolSmart. It's a long-standing network that provides a variety of resources on this topic. Also, the U.S. Green Building Council's LEED for Cities offers frameworks that incentivize resilient infrastructure investments. So another thing that Bend could do would be to engage relevant stakeholders. One would be to start having more conversations with local businesses and nonprofits. If you recall, going back to the Baltimore example, talking to the local constituents is a really critical part of standing up a productive and effective resilience hub network, because you really need to ground the effort in what they need and what their problems are. Second, you can connect with a variety of city and community networks. There's groups out there like USDN that are national networks. There's also, I believe United Oregon has a group that particularly talks about resilience hubs. So there's a lot, there may be others you can connect with to share lessons learned. You can connect with your utility. There may be innovative or creative opportunities that you could explore with them about. They also control another important piece of this whole process, which is the interconnection piece. Before any system can come online, the utility often needs to okay it, give it the green light before it becomes operational. So working with them to speed up interconnection processes at a minimum could be a useful place to start. There's also potential to engage the state legislature, and I'll say more about that on the next slide. And then the Public Utilities Commission here in Oregon is a group that oversees all of the utilities, and they welcome comments as part of their public processes on an ongoing basis. You're fortunate in that the state legislature is paying attention to resilience hubs right now. In 2025, they approved 2 bills that support the deployment of microgrids. The first essentially requires that people who want to install a solar plus storage system have the opportunity or the option to work with a third-party consultant to conduct their engineering study instead of waiting for the utility to do it. The second requires that the PUC, or the Public Utilities Commission, establish a regulatory framework for allowing the ownership, deployment, and use of microgrids and community microgrids within service territories of electric companies. Basically, the PUC has to go take a closer look at how they can support microgrids in the future. All right, and last, this is a denser slide, but I wanted to conclude this section with a variety of the lessons learned based on our work with communities across the country on deploying these types of facilities. The first, and I said this before, but it bears repeating, having conversations early is really critical. This is both internal to local governments, talking to different departments such as finance, legal, procurement, understanding what their concerns might be and getting them on board early is really powerful and helps avoid big headaches down the road. Also talking to local community groups and engaging them on what they need and what this might look like. Then again, it's important to partner with community organizations and local businesses. Again, going back to the Baltimore and the New Orleans examples, both of those networks of hubs largely sited their facilities in community, in buildings owned by community groups as opposed to municipal facilities. And this is in part because in a lot of cases, community members might feel a lot more comfortable going to a place that's owned by a community group as opposed to something that's owned by the local government. Or they may have trouble accessing a municipally owned building in certain circumstances. Then there's a whole process of understanding where your sites should be, working with your partners, understanding which communities within your boundaries are going to be most vulnerable to different types of events, and understanding what services they will need are all important. Then going back to where we started, when you actually get to designing your facility, it's really critical to start with energy efficiency. And this, again, is thinking about if you're going to be buying a diesel generator or a wind or micro turbine or solar and batteries to power a facility, you want to minimize the load that facility is going to require. It's often called the critical load. And one of the really effective ways to do that is to really make that building very energy efficient. If you seal all the gaps in the windows, put in more insulation, perhaps build in thermal mass in the building, all of those things might help enable the building to be more resilient. Even if all the systems fail, and there's this concept of hours of safety that's relevant here. Basically, if all the power goes out, how long will the building remain safe to stay in? And the more efficient your building is, the tighter the envelope it has, the longer people will be able to stay in a building and be safe from extreme temperatures. Once you've done the energy efficiency that you can, then you can go and design the heat pump system, start sizing the other appliances, and thinking about what the other critical load requirements should be. And then finally, at that point, once you understand what your requirements are, you can go and figure out the sizing of the solar and the storage and the diesel genset and all the other things that you might want. And there are a variety of ways, as we saw in that picture from Austin, how you might want to enhance a resilience hub with, say, EV charging, et cetera. Okay, we're at the conclusion. We're almost done. again, a few thoughts here. One, whole systems thinking can unlock expanding opportunities. And I invite us all to think more about energy efficiency and expanding the size of the problem that we are thinking about to achieve better outcomes. Second, the need for resilient systems is growing and is going to continue to grow into the future. Third, clean microgrids are a proven means of enhancing power reliability at critical facilities. Cities are integrating these microgrids into resilience hubs to bolster community resilience more broadly. And finally, Bend has a variety of opportunities to foster this type of local resilient infrastructure through policy, engagement, and direct deployment. And I want to leave us, given that I had such a pessimistic beginning, I wanted to leave us with an optimistic ending. This is just a quote, again, from our co-founder, Amory Lovins, about applied hope, which is one of the values we try to live by at RMI. And I'm just going to read this. Many of us here stir and strive in the spirit of applied hope. We work to make the world better, not from some airy theoretical hope, but in the pragmatic and grounded conviction that starting with hope and acting out of hope can cultivate a different kind of world worth being hopeful about, reinforcing itself in a virtuous spiral. Applied hope is not about some vague, far-off future, but is expressed and created moment by moment through our choices. With that, thank you very much for your attention.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. It was fantastic. We are going to go into a Q&A. So we're going to have some microphones. We have one at the back. So if we want to start, we have one here.
Thank you. Kathy Austin, local architect, serial board member for multiple boards here. I have a question. I'm sure in the Rocky Mountains you probably have as much snow as we get here in Bend. And we've had with climate change, we've had some significant hailstorms. And I'm just wondering about the resiliency itself of the solar panel systems, your experience with going through that. And then also keeping them clean. We have a lot of dust here too. Yep. So just kind of the practicality of how well they work, what systems are available to keep them working well, and then also kind of the life cycle cost of a typical solar panel now.
Those are great questions. And yes, in the Rocky Mountains, we do get a lot of snow and a lot of hail. I believe our systems up in Basalt have been working well, but it's probably something to be cognizant of when you're buying panels and looking at panels that are designed to withstand those types of weather events. I know in particular, for example, there are a variety of issues with high wind speeds and panels getting blown about too. So you do need to be thinking about the environment you're building in and designing appropriately. And on the dust side, yes, that is an issue, and panels do require regular cleaning. One of the things that's perhaps worth thinking about in that context is if you're going into an installation process, ensuring that you have a plan for how the panels are going to be maintained and what the incentives of the different parties are. There are different types of structures that are often used. For example, in a lease, the building owner is leasing the equipment just the way you might lease a car. The incentives in that structure do not incentivize the owner of the system to ensure that they are operating at peak performance. Whereas there are other structures like a power purchase agreement where they are better incentivized to try to maintain that equipment. Or if you're owning the equipment yourself, you probably want to plan on operations and maintenance costs and have a partner who's going to be monitoring the panel's performance over the lifetime of the asset, all secured up front, so that because there is a danger that you install these things and if they're not properly maintained, they're not going to operate the way that they should. In terms of the life cycle costs of solar and wind, they continue to be at a large scale some of the cheapest electricity in the United States. That's even without some of the tax credits that are about to go away. It is more expensive when you put them on the top top of a building, typically. The larger the scale of the building, the greater economies of scale you can get. And I could go into LCOEs, but that's probably not helpful in this context. But I'd be happy to talk more afterwards.
Hi, my name's Daniel. Do you know of any like HOA scale microgrids? So we have some builders in the community that do large community plans, multiple acres of residential. Is there any groups or models that show like battery packs for say 10 or 15 homes that all have solar that then they can do a microgrid of that scale? Is there examples of that?
It's a good question. I mean, the example of the military base is sort of at that scale, perhaps. I haven't personally seen examples of whole neighborhoods being on a microgrid yet. They may exist. I might just not be familiar with them. But there are certainly batteries that are being rolled out that are large enough to manage that kind of groups of facilities.
My name is John Lamont. I'm a city planning consultant. I'm on the planning commission here. And can you lend any research that RMI might have regarding these micro plants for business parks and industrial districts to add another incentive for people to come and develop in our city? And especially comment on the, this new trend towards a small nuclear plant. And is it fission or fusion?
Yeah. On the first question, there's actually a variety of good examples coming out of the data center market that we've been seeing, with data centers wanting to, not wanting to wait until the utility can interconnect them. So there's this notion of bring your own power, where they're installing a lot of, hopefully solar and wind and batteries. In some cases, we've seen data centers installing sort of fleets of microturbines, which are more problematic in some cases. But I think that those facilities demonstrate that you certainly can have microgrids at industrial scales for those types of facilities. On the SMRs, there are, as far as I know, there are no active SMRs in the United States. And so it's difficult for us to really evaluate those technologies because they're all still kind of in pilot stage. Those would be fission reactors, is my understanding, as opposed to fusion. It's a new generation of facility. There's a lot of claims that they are much safer and have automatic shutoffs and use different types of fuels. I am not an expert on all of those issues, but I think my personal take is I am waiting to see what the costs of those units and the safety element considerations for them are when they actually start being deployed.
Get my steps in today. Yeah, thanks. Hi, ML Vitas. And my question has to do with that map you showed of Baltimore and the number of resilience hubs. Has RMI looked at, like, what's a good number of hubs? If the city of Bend were to say, yeah, we should maybe look at this in our planning as we're doing things at the city scale or incentivizing development, how many resilience hubs does a place need? Or is there a good metric that we could look at?
Yeah. I think in terms of what we have seen to date, I think the range of around 15 to 20 is the most I have seen. One key consideration I didn't talk about here is it's often considered important for these to be within walking distance of the communities that they are trying to serve. If the roads are shut down, if they don't have access to a vehicle. So I think it would be a question of which communities are most in need for these facilities. How many people do you think would actually show up? And then how many do you need in those neighborhoods to make them as walkable as possible, with something like a 15 to 20 minute walk probably being about the maximum that you could expect everyone to be able to make, or not everyone even then.
Hi. Whoa, John Gilbert here. Okay, this is a little bit of a redundant question because my question ties in a little bit with Daniel's question and the planning commissioner's question. And just broadly speaking, what makes more sense, doing this at on a privately or publicly? So in other words, like privately could be a large land developer that's building a 500-acre mixed-use community, or a dozen homes, or an industrial park. Or the other public would be municipal.
Yeah.
Pros and cons, I guess, of each.
Actually, I'm going to amend my response to your question first. I believe there is a community called Babcock Ranch in Florida that has deployed solar and batteries across the entire neighborhood, and that along with a lot of water management facilities or strategies to make that community very resilient during hurricanes. That's a great question. I have mostly seen publicly funded or philanthropically funded hubs to date. And I think part of that is coming from the desire to serve low income or vulnerable communities. If there was a model, I think there is a very reasonable model where developers could be developing new sets of houses that are resilient, and I think there would be an appetite in the market for that. In terms of what, so I think that is one solution, and I think on the public side, it makes sense for local governments and philanthropy to focus on the most vulnerable communities.
Hi, Stephen Ames. I'm curious, a couple questions about how resilience centers function in good times and in those occasional times when there's a real crisis happening. And I don't know if maybe from Baltimore or from Louisiana, you can, if in your experience, you've actually been able to envision or observe how one of these facilities works in those kinds of situations. And a second part of that question is, I'm just going to say 98% of the time when a facility is not under stress due to a community emergency of some kind, how aggressively and actively are they used by the community? So kind of a two-part question. Thanks.
Yeah. So how do they operate during blue sky days and then black sky days? Yes. On the blue sky one, it's a great question because I think going back to something I mentioned in the presentation, it is critical if you expect people to come to a place when they are scared and when there is an emergency, it has to be some place that they trust, generally speaking. And so it's really important for the group that is operating the center to be engaging the community on a regular basis. And I think that can look differently depending on the context. If it's a church, that's going to have a different, fairly natural way to engage at least some parts of the community through their regular, operations. If it's something like a community center operated by the municipal government or a nonprofit, they're going to have to be more intentional about doing that outreach and making sure that everybody is aware that this is a new service that they are offering. In terms of the black sky days, I haven't seen it myself. I did just escape New Orleans before they got hit with snow this past January, so I maybe just missed it. But I have seen videos, and my understanding is that they have, as I said, a bank of cell phone numbers that they send text to when the power goes out, and then people come. They have heat pumps that cool the building. They have water. People can charge their phones. There's games for the kids to play because they're going to be cooped up in this small room for like a few hours. And in some cases, there's an opportunity to expand those types of services for these community centers to try to deliver food or go check on people who are not able to leave their apartment without assistance and things like that. The exact nature of how they're going to operate is something that I think should be co-created with the community as much as possible to ensure that it's effective.
Hi, I'm Ben Weber. Thanks, Steve, for being here tonight. It's been really interesting information, really valuable. I notice we're on a brand spanking new campus of a university with engineering and STEM programs and social science and mental health programs, kind of running the gamut of topics that might constitute resiliency, both technically and kind of community-based, and wondering if you're seeing universities or just education programs generally being leaders in developing resiliency hubs academically and deploying them.
Yeah, I think there's a long-standing tradition of some universities having their own power generation and the ability to continue to operate in an outage for their own, safety of their students, et cetera. I have yet to see a university step into a role of opening its doors in the event of an emergency to the general public or specific groups, but I could be not aware of some examples, certainly. That's great.
I got another quick question regarding RMI. With your huge organization and your track record in research, how much have you been in fire resiliency, which is the hottest topic in town right now? So have you dealt with it? Do you have materials available? Do you have research available that we could tap into? That would be helpful. That would be great.
It is, I don't have any off-the-shelf resources to point you to. It is a topic we're trying to take a look at. Our focus is really the energy system, and so we're trying to figure out where the useful place for us to engage is on that front. One idea we're exploring is trying to partner or forge partnerships, if we're not directly involved, between insurance companies and communities, recognizing the difficulties in getting insurance in places like California and Florida. We think there might be an opportunity for insurers or reinsurers to invest more in these types of resilient solutions and mitigation and adaptation as a means of reducing their exposure.
I figure if you got to ask two questions, I could too. I do quite a bit of work in California in residential design, and I have to put solar on every house we design there now. So there's been discussion about a glut of producing power and how the grid manages that, and then also whether or not the utility will reimburse and that sort of thing. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that as a concern as we move forward. It's not exactly a resilience hub question, but it is an issue. And then also, where are we on batteries right now?
Well, great questions. California is a bit of a unique case. And if you may have heard about the California duck curve, which is this wonky, but this famous chart in energy wonk circles, where you have peak demand occurring essentially when solar on rooftops stops producing. California has recently adjusted what's called their net energy metering laws, or their net metering laws, to incentivize solar plus batteries as opposed to just solar, which I think is designed to largely try to start to address that problem. Outside of California, I don't think that is an immediate concern in most jurisdictions. Most places have lots of capacity to add more solar. Hawaii might be another exception to that. But generally speaking, most other places are not nearly at California's penetration levels. But it is ultimately a concern. And there are some legitimate concerns about net metering policies and the potential for the fact that they could, in fact, be regressive in some ways if people who are wealthier can put solar on their rooftop and benefit from that and receive full compensation. There's an argument that the cost of the grid is being pushed more to those people who aren't able to put solar on their rooftop. And those are legitimate. And again, I think California is really at the forefront of trying to manage those problems. storage is the hottest topic in town right now. And I think with all of with the increase in EV production in particular, we're seeing a big uptick in terms of the scale of batteries. The costs are coming down really significantly. I would not be surprised if we start seeing, I mean, we're already seeing lots of grid scale deployments of batteries in places like Texas. I would not be surprised if lots of us ultimately end up having a battery in our neighborhood or in our house in 10 years. But that's pure speculation. Okay. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Steve. I'd also like to thank again recognize our title sponsor, First Interstate Bank, and all of our sponsors that made this event possible. Tonight's lecture has been recorded and it'll be soon available on our YouTube website. So pay attention to that if you know anybody who missed the event and wanted to see it. Also, stay tuned to our website for announcements of our 2026 lecture series. And thank you very much for joining us on this inspiring event.